Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this 5,000 watt Powermate generator. This is powered by a 10 horse Briggs and Stratton engine and was dropped off by my friend Jason. He pulled this machine from the trash, so I don't know anything about it, but from looking at it, it appears to be in really good condition. I don't see any damage, all the parts are there, so that begs the question, why would someone throw away this machine? Well, I can think of one good reason. I tried to pull the engine over, and unfortunately, the engine's stuck. So, did it run out of oil? Will this engine run again? I'm not sure, but that's what we're going to find out today. So first things first, let's check the oil. This does have an oil sensor, which appears to be connected, so unless it was malfunctioning, we shouldn't be out of oil, and we are a little low, but there is plenty of oil in there, so lack of oil is not the issue. So the fact we have oil is a good sign. I'd say this engine has a chance. So I'm going to pull the plug. I just want to make sure we're not hydrolocked. If water or fuel gets in the cylinder, then the engine can lock up because you can't compress a liquid. And the plug does not feel very good coming out. Although it's getting better, but I can't turn it out by hand yet. There we go. That's not a good sign. It looks like there is a bit of rust on the plug. So where there's rust, there's water, and I'm willing to bet that that's why the engine is stuck. Now, I guess the good news is the cylinder on this engine, it is aluminum, and so is the piston. So really the only things that can rust here are the valves or the piston rings. So I'm thinking, let's just pull the valve cover off, see if there's any signs of moisture in there. And with the plug out, we're still locked up. It's not a good sign that those are also tight. Yeah, the valves look good, so do the rockers. And both valves open, so the valves are not stuck. So that is a good sign. Yeah, before I spray any oil down in there, let's take a quick look with the borescope. All right, let's take a look and see what we see. Wow. I was not expecting that. That is a complete mess. So I thought this bore was an aluminum bore, but clearly I was wrong, judging by the amount of rust on the cylinder walls. So on the right, that rusty area, that is the cylinder wall. To your left, that is the piston. So, yeah, I was hoping this engine was a little stuck, but based on what I'm seeing, it's a lot stuck, and not due to a lack of oil. Somehow water or moisture got on the cylinder and caused quite a bit of damage. So, I think there's no doubt this engine has to come apart. And I guess the question is, will it go back together again? So before I take it apart, I do want to try to break that piston free, at least a little bit, so that way when we get to the point of pulling it out, it might be a little bit easier. So I'm going to spray some PB Blaster down there. We'll try to work the crank a bit, just to get a little bit of movement out of it. It's not what you want to see coming out of a cylinder. At least we know it was thrown away for good reason. Let's see, did that make any difference? Yeah, actually. Still looks terrible, but a little bit less. To get a wrench on the flywheel nut, we need to pull this cover. The starter recoil, it is riveted on, so we actually need to pull the blower housing. And before we can do that, we actually need to pull the carburetor. So I'm just going to pull all this stuff out of the way so we can get access to what we need. It's interesting that there's dirt on the side that the filter is supposed to be protecting. A little bit of junk in here. Now the flywheel, it is severely rusted to the point where it could potentially be making contact with that ignition coil. And the crank's definitely not locked. And we have just a little bit of movement out of it. So let's get this coil off and put a wrench on this. Wow. I was going to say that broke free surprisingly easy, but only when going backwards. So I'm guessing that is the bottom of the travel of the piston. And as soon as it gets to, well, the top, it meets a lot of resistance. So I'm going to work at this a bit, see if we can't make any progress. Yeah, we're making progress, but I'm not sure we're going to get there. And we actually do need to get the piston to the top if we want to get the crankshaft out. So I'm thinking it might be a little easier to pull the head. And, you know, since we can lower the piston, we can probably get a hone in there and just try to break up some of that heavy rust. And then we might be able to get the piston to the top. Yeah, it's amazing how the borescope always makes things look worse than they are. Granted, it's not great, but it doesn't look as bad. Although up here, it is pretty rough. I think that's actually what we were looking at with the borescope. But I'd say from here down, it's definitely rough and gritty, but I think that would clean up. Top, though, I'm not sure about. Anyway, let's get this stuff out of here. You know, we can rotate the piston to the bottom, which it is right there. And we'll just try to clean this up the best we can. And see if we can get the piston to the top of its stroke. Yeah, the scary thing is the piston is pushing and pulling air. So, yeah, as bad as this looks, technically this would run. I'm sure it would smoke and burn oil. But it would run. It's amazing, actually, how well this cleaned up. I only honed it for about a minute, and the purpose of the honing wasn't to clean up the cylinder. It was just to free the piston. And yeah, this is actually very encouraging. So as it is right now, I mean, technically, I could throw a new head gasket on, and I think this engine would run. How well, I'm not sure. But I'm thinking let's give it the best chance possible. We do need to get the piston out and hone the cylinder properly to give this engine a fighting chance. The oil actually looks pretty good. I mean, it's a little on the thick side, well used, but at least there's no water or fuel mixed in. So I'm hoping whatever happened to the cylinder didn't cause any damage down on the bottom end. But so far, I'd say things are looking pretty good. I think the next move here is to get the flywheel off, as well as this right here. And then finally, we'll get the generator off the engine. quite a bit of rust on this rotor. Yeah, it shouldn't impact the way that it works as long as it's not making contact with the stator. So we are going to have to very lightly sand that just to kind of knock it down a bit so that we have proper clearance. It makes me wonder where this machine was stored. You know, it looks in fairly good shape, but when you see something like this, and of course something like the cylinder, you know, it doesn't really fit when looking at the rest of the machine. Anyway, I'm going to try to just use a 3-pound hammer and shock this off the tapered shaft. Now this one you do have to be careful with because this bolt, it's pretty thin, and you can definitely pretzel the bolt. So you don't want to go crazy hitting it. The other thing you can do is put threads on here. There are no threads, and you can pull it off that way. The problem is this rotor uses a bushing right here, and if you use this to pull the rotor off, there's a chance you could actually pull that bushing out, in which case the rotor, well, I don't want to say it's bad, but you're definitely going to have to do some work to get it to where it should be. You know, hitting the bolt, worst case you damage the bolt. Actually, I guess worst case is you miss and you destroy the rotor, so don't miss. That might be it. Yep. Crankshaft is pretty rusted up right here by the oil seal, and the cover's not going to come off with that rust. So we can try to sand it. You know, I think ultimately I might have to pull the oil seal so I can sand a little bit deeper, but let's try it like this first. Next, I'm going to crack these bolts free for the crankcase cover, and then we'll get the engine off the frame and open it up. Well, we've got good news. The bottom end is in very good shape. There is no rust to speak of. A little bit of dust right there from when I took the cover off, but otherwise in very good condition. Let's get the camshaft out, then we can get the cap out as well as the piston and rod, and then finally the crankshaft. Well, thankfully, there's no surprises in the bottom end. Whatever got in the cylinder did not make it down there. So, these components, I think, are fine. The crankshaft basically looks new on these journals on the ends. And the main journal, also in pretty good shape. Visually, there is a little mark right there, but it is nothing that can be felt. The camshaft, it's in equally good shape. The lobes look good as well as the journals. The piston has a bit of wear, but again, nothing unusual. A few scratches on the skirts, but the piston itself, I think, can be reused. The rings, though, that's a different story. Only the bottom ring is free. The top two are stuck, so we are likely going to need a new set of rings. Even if they weren't stuck, you should get a new set of rings after you hone a cylinder. So we will get a new set of rings. The connecting rod is in decent shape, not great. You can see some marks, but none of that can be felt. And again, the bottom end, that's not why we opened up this machine. We opened it up to get the piston out to solve this problem. So let's run the hone in there now that we have full access to the bore and just see what we can do with this. So the purpose of this honing is just to take the rust off. I'm not going to be putting a crosshatch on yet. So we'll run this in here for a bit, clean up the rust, and then I'm going to take some measurements. I want to see if this is going to be viable. And if it is, we'll add some crosshatch. That looks pretty good. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. That's only about 10 seconds with the hone. And you can still see blemishes, but I cannot feel them anymore. So I'm going to run the hone in there just a little bit longer, and then we'll measure things up. I'm pretty happy with that. It feels really good. Doesn't look good. You know, there's still a stain. And even though I wasn't aiming for crosshatch, I'm also pretty happy with that as well. So let's take some measurements and see if this is going to be viable. So I've got the bore gauge calibrated to 3.12 inches. We need to take a total of 6 measurements to kind of find out what's going on with this cylinder. So we're going to take a measurement at the top, the middle, and the bottom of the ring travel, both from left to right. And then we'll rotate the gauge and check 3 more measurements from top to bottom. So let's start from left to right. Now we want this to be at 0, and each line is 5 ten-thousandths. Yeah, so we got about 1,000th of wear on the top. About 1/2 thousandth in the middle. And 1,000th on the bottom. So yeah, from left to right, that's looking pretty good. Yeah, 1,000th of wear on the top. Yeah, about 1.5 thousandths in the middle. And about the same on the bottom. Well, I've got good news. I double checked the specs, and we are allowed up to 3 thousandths of wear. And we're only at 1.5 thousandths. So from that point of view, we are looking pretty good. The other measurement of concern is out of round. We are allowed 1.5 thousandths out of round. And right now, we're 1,000th out of round. So this cylinder, it's good. The parts, they've been ordered. They'll be here in about a week. So while we wait for those parts to show up, we need to prep this for reassembly. We need to clean off the old head gasket material as well as the old sump gasket. And then we'll move on. We got to clean up the cover as well as the head. I'm not too worried about this material getting in the bore or anywhere because the block, it is going to be fully washed out. The block is pretty much ready to go, with the exception of the oil seal. That is on order, so it'll still be a few days before we see that. You know, everything's been thoroughly washed with soap and water, blown dry, and re-oiled. And the same for the cover. You know, it is pretty much ready to go. So let's shift gears and clean up the cylinder head. I think we got pretty lucky as far as the cylinder head goes. You know, these valves could have rusted up really bad, and instead we only have a light surface rust. That said, though, I do want to get the valves out, get them cleaned up, we'll lap them in, and I do want to decarbon everything. This carbon, it's pretty loose and flaky. You can see we got a bunch down there, and the carbon, that will score and damage the cylinder, and we have enough damage in there already. So we want to make this as clean as we can. So to get the valves out, I'm going to use a spring compressor. Before we can get that on, though, we have to get the rockers out of the way. The valve's just held in by these keepers, so one of them just fell out. And once the other one's out, we can take the tension off. And the spring and the retainer should just come right out, as well as the valve. And yeah, there's actually a bit of rust on the top side here and on the face. Just light surface rust. That should clean up. The intake looks a little worse. So it's definitely pretty gritty. I'm hoping a lot of that is carbon, but it could be rust. So I'm going to spin these in the drill. We'll just use some Scotch-Brite to clean it up, and we'll get a better look at what these actually look like. Intake, it isn't cleaning up that well. So I'm not so sure about it. I did just dig through my parts bin, though, and I do have a set of valves from kind of the next size up version of this engine. And I did a quick check. And the valves, they do seem like they're the same part. So I'm thinking the way to go here is to probably use these valves since they were never exposed to water. You know, I also have the corresponding exhaust valve. And it is the same part. So I'm thinking we use the good set of valves and, yeah, probably retire these. And as far as the head goes, there is rust on the seat as well. So hopefully no pitting, although it's kind of rubbing off pretty easily. So I'm thinking that rust might have just transferred from the valve, and the seat itself might be okay. So I'm going to use a Dremel with a stainless little wire wheel to clean this up, and we'll get a better look at it. Both the intake and the exhaust cleaned up pretty well. Got a nice defined line going around. The valves, when they go in, like before, put a little pressure and they don't spin. So, you know, I think these are going to work fine, certainly better than the valves that came out of there. And the seats, they also cleaned up pretty well. So I'm going to get the exhaust valve back in. The intake, we can't do yet until we get that new seal for the valve stem. Just take note when installing these keepers, there's two of them, and there's a thick side and a thin side. The thin side goes down, and to get these installed, it's very helpful to use a bit of grease to help stick them in place until you release the spring, and then the spring pushes the retainer up, holding these in place. All right, that one's in. I think that's it. I'm glad we had that extra set of used valves. These, I don't think we're going to cut it. Anyway, we've taken the head as far as we can for now. Until we get that valve stem seal, we can't finish it up. Really, the only other thing we could do is clean up the piston. The top side does have some carbon on it, but I think I'm going to leave that alone for now. It is soaking in evaporust. I'm hoping by the time the parts arrive that those rings will have freed up. Yeah, I guess while we're waiting for the parts, we should take a look at this carb. It looks pretty dirty from the outside. I'm not sure if it's ever been cleaned. So we'll get it opened up. These screws I did break loose already with some vice grips. If you don't use vice grips, you're almost guaranteed to strip these out. Yeah, a lot of junk in the bowl. Don't think it's rust though. That should clean up. We've got a spring here. That is the main jet. Looks to be clogged. We'll get the pin out. Needle looks to be in pretty good shape. And that's pretty much it on these carbs. There's a lot of plastic, so there's not a lot to go wrong. But we do have this pretty big elaborate gasket here, and this needs to be in good condition or else the carb will not run correctly. So, sometimes I take these out, but, if you do that, there's a pretty good chance you're not going to be able to reuse it. So I'm going to leave it in there for now. When it goes through the ultrasonic, it might just release without endangering it. Anyway, there is some debris, so we need to clean that up. Just make sure the passages are clear. And we also need to get the main jet out. And just make sure that's clean as well. Actually, the main jet seems to be clear. So even though there's a bunch of junk in the bowl, there's a pretty good chance this carb would have run the engine. So we'll make sure that these pickup tubes are clear. I believe these pick up fuel for the pilot circuit. So that is good. And just make sure everything is clear. Carb cleaned up really well. Almost looks like new, so much better than when we started. The gasket looks like it also survived the ultrasonic, so pretty sure this is going to run the engine well. The only thing that's not spotless is the bowl. You know, that stain down there, it is just that from corrosion. So there's no loose debris. You know, the bowl should work fine. So let's get it together. We do need to get the main jet in first. The narrow end goes down with the O-ring. And just make sure it's fully seated. Like that. And the hinge for the float's right there. That is the fuel inlet. And you want to align that with the fuel inlet right there. Like that. Oop. Almost forgot the spring. Well, it's been just over 2 weeks, and we finally have what we need to get this thing back together. We've got the new gaskets, the new seals, and a new set of rings. There we go. So now that we have the new valve stem seal in, we can finish up the head. So we'll get the intake valve installed as well as the rockers. And really the last big obstacle here is this piston. We do need to reuse it. It has been soaking in evaporust for 2 weeks, and you can see the second ring, it's completely freed up. And even the first ring, it popped out on this side. It's actually still stuck over here, but I don't think it's going to take a whole lot to break that free. So I'm going to work at this for a bit. And I'm going to try to save these rings. Even though I did order new rings, technically they're not the right part for this engine. The rings that are on here now, they are discontinued. But I did find another set of rings that are for this piston and for a later model of this engine. So I think the new rings I got will fit. But just in case, we're going to try to save these. So worst case, we will have something for this engine. Although this ring, it is still very stuck in there. There we go. So there's the top ring. The second ring, and then we just have this oil ring. And there we go. So I'm going to bring this over to the vise. I got to clean this carbon off. And I'm suspecting it's going to come off real easy since this was soaking for the better part of 2 weeks. And then we'll just make sure these ring lins are clear. And we'll put the new rings on. Yeah, I was just double checking the end gap on the new rings, and I found the number 2 and the number 3 ring were fine. The number 1 was a little tight by about 0.04 of an inch. So I was getting ready to shave some material off, and then I realized something. The new rings were fitting pretty loose on the piston. So I double checked the thickness, and the new rings, they're at 0.0455 inches, whereas the old ones, they are quite a bit thicker at 0.0585. So yeah, as much as I want to use a new set of rings, in this case, I think sticking with the old would be the better choice. And I did double check these old rings as well, as far as the gap. And the top ring actually was almost perfect at 0.12 of an inch. So the rings are all free. They move quite well. So we'll just oil it up and get this piston reinstalled. And just make sure the rings are staggered. The top ring I have to the left, middle ring to the right, and the oil ring I have it about 90 degrees away from the top two rings. And just take note, the arrow points toward the flywheel. And also on the connecting rod, it says the same. Magneto, PTO. I've got everything coated in assembly lube here, including the new seal. Yeah, these bolts, they originally had thread locker on there, so I'm just going to add it back. I'm going to get some oil in this engine. We're at the point in the build where I'm getting a little bit excited to hear this run. And I'd hate to do something stupid like start it without any oil. So according to Google, this should take 800 milliliters of oil. And Google was right. We are full right to the last thread. I'm just degreasing the mating surface. So we'll get the locating pins installed, throw the new head gasket on, and bolt the head back in place. The torque spec on these head bolts, it's 220 inch-pounds. So I'm going to bring it up to 100 inch-pounds first, and then I'll finish it off at 220. Both valves have clearance. They do feel pretty tight though, so let's double check them. Briggs does call for 5/1000ths of an inch, plus or minus 1/1000th on each of these. So I'm going to likely set these a little bit different than recommended. Usually the intake I do on the tight side of the spec. So in this case, closer to 4/1000ths, and the exhaust a little bit on the high side of the spec, about 6/1000ths. So we're just a little bit past top dead center. So let's start with the 6/1000ths. That is the high side of the spec on each of these valves. And on the intake, it's actually quite loose. So we absolutely have to adjust that. The 6/1000ths on the exhaust fits better, but it's still loose. So both valves need an adjustment. So I'm going to aim for 5/1000ths. And the reason for that is because when I tighten up this lock nut, usually we lose a little bit. So the 5 feels pretty good. We'll snug that down and double check. So a 6 is tight, won't go in. 5 still feels pretty good. And a 4, there's a bit of drag, so I'm happy with that. So let's crack the exhaust free. And this one I'm going to set to a tight 6. Yep, that feels good there. Six feels good, plenty of drag, and a 7 does not fit. So the valves, I think they're all set. So let's get the valve cover back on. I'm just sanding the flywheel very lightly because some of this rust, it is raised, and that's going to potentially cause an issue when trying to gap the coil. So we'll just knock the high spots off, and then we should be good to go. And this gap should be 0.010 of an inch. And most business cards are 0.010 of an inch, which is what I'm using to gap this coil. So now it should be gapped. Let's just get the card back and snug up these bolts. The old plug, not in great shape. It probably still works, but I did pick up a new Champion RC12 YC. So I want to take the tension off this governor spring a bit. You know, the first time I start the engine, I don't want it running at 3,600 RPM. So the way you're supposed to do it on a Briggs is just bend the tab to adjust the tension, which we could do. But there's only so many times you can bend this, and, you know, it's likely in the position it needs to be in. So instead, I'm going to just move the spring position one hole closer. That should take off about 600 RPM, maybe a little bit more. And it will change the sensitivity. But for testing, that should be fine. We'll just set it back when we're done. So I'm just going to hook this switch up temporarily. You know, I'm not going to commit fully until we've tested this. So the kill wire going to the coil, that is the middle position. The ground wire, which is the red one, connects on the side that says on. And the oil sensor will go on the last position. Well, I've got the engine bolted back to the frame. I'm not going to get the generator on yet. I do want to get the engine started. Make sure there's no surprises. Okay, good. Carb is full of fuel, and the needle and seat are holding. So let's pull it over, see what we get. All right, ignition's on, choke's on. I think we're looking pretty good here. The engine started first pull, sounds really good. And more importantly, we're not burning any oil. So despite the starting condition of the cylinder, I think it is a survivor. So, at this point, I have no reservation to getting the power head bolted back on. So I'm going to get this back on the lift and we'll finish it up. Before I torque the rotor down, I do want to very lightly sand this rust. I just want to get the high spots off. I don't want to be too rough with these laminations. Really, I'm just looking to ensure that we do have proper clearance between the stator and the rotor. And before we get the end housing on, I'm just going to put a little bit of grease here. There is a roller bearing as well right here. So I don't want to put too much because that could fly off and hit the slip rings. But we do want to get a little bit of fresh grease in here to help that bearing out. I pulled the spark plug back out so we don't have compression fighting us. We need to do an important step here. Now that the stator and the rotor are reinstalled, we need to make sure the alignment is good. Sometimes if things don't seat right, you could get binding or scraping. So pull it over. Make sure you don't hear that rotor making contact. And in this case, the generator spins freely, so I think we're good to move on. So I'm going to put this spring back to where it was. And I'm thinking, now that we have the generator installed, let's start it again and make sure we have power. All right, let's try this again. This time we got a light plugged in and turned on. So hopefully it lights up. Well, it's always a risk fixing one major problem, assuming that you're not going to have two. And thankfully we don't, because this generator works perfectly. Right when the engine started, that light turned on. The voltage was at 130 volts, which seems high, but this does not have an AVR, and that voltage is normal. It'll actually come down by about 20 volts when under full load. The engine speed was also good at 61.8 hertz. That said though, I do need to break the engine in, so I am going to put that spring back where it was for the break-in period. And once that's complete, we will load test this. But for now, let's just get it fully back together and we'll get it outside. Well, I thought we were pretty much done, but I went to put the tank back on and I couldn't help but notice we do have a crack in that bushing. So if it's not leaking already, it is going to leak really soon. So let me fight with this for a minute. We'll get this valve out and get a new bushing installed. Yeah, a little bit of water came out with that valve, but the tank itself is actually dry. That said, though, there is a little bit of varnish right down at the very bottom, so I'm going to try to clean that up, and then we'll get the new valve installed. Yeah, that worked pretty well. Yeah, I just used a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and that varnish and sludge came right out of there. So before we load test this, I do need to break the engine in. Now, granted, we are using old rings, but we did hone the cylinder, so there is going to be a little bit of metal in the oil while the rings kind of break in against the fresh crosshatch. So I'm going to run this for an hour or two with a 1500 watt load. I will change the oil and then likely do that a couple times until the oil comes out clean. Well, it's been running for just over an hour without any issues. So I'm going to take the load off, let the engine cool down. We'll drain the oil, see what it looks like. I think you can see there is some metallic in that oil for sure. So I would say we do need to run it for at least another hour. We'll drain the oil again and see how it looks. I don't see much of a difference. This is the first oil change, and that is the second right there. So I'm going to run it, I'd say at least for another hour, and we'll change the oil again. Then I'm going to get these inside. We'll just take a closer look at each one. Anyway, my camera is low on battery, so, this one I am not going to record. Really? I don't see a big difference between these two oil changes. So the one here on the right is the first one we did, and the left is the one we just did. So yeah, I would say we do need to run this for at least another hour. So the camera is actually getting low on battery, so I'm not going to record this go round, but I will turn it back on once we drain this oil, and we'll compare it to the other two. I've got the 3 oils lined up in a row from first oil change to last oil change, and none of them look terrible. But when you mix it up, you can see a bit of metallic. So first oil change, not too bad. Second oil change, you can still see it a bit. And the last oil change, still not perfect, but definitely a lot better than the first. Anyway, we've got 3 hours of runtime now on this engine, so I'm thinking let's do the load test and see if it can pull its rated load of 5,000 watts. Well, it's the moment of truth. Can this machine that I gave pretty much a 0% chance of ever running again pull its rated load of 5,000 watts? That we're about to find out. All right, it started without any issue, without a load. We're starting at about 12.2% THD. And the sine wave, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to see today. It's pretty cold out, and I think the battery just doesn't have enough in it. So let's start with a half load of 2,500 watts. So we'll put on a 2,000 watt load. No issues. 2,500 watts. No issues. So under a half load, we're at 13.2% THD, which actually isn't too bad. So we'll give it a few minutes. Assuming things go well, we'll bring the load up, hopefully to the max of 5,000 watts. Well, it's been a few minutes. It's had no issues pulling a half load. So let's bring the load up. I'm going to swap a 500 for 1,000. So now we're at 3,000 watts. 3,500, 4,000. Seems to be holding pretty well. So let's swap this for a 2. So that brings us back to 4,000. At 4,000 watts, we're at about 16% THD. So let's go for the max rated of 5,000. That's 4,500. 5,000 watts. Pretty good, right about 57 hertz. And the THD, 17.3, 17.4. So yeah, not too bad considering where we started. So I'm going to give this a few minutes, then I'll take the load off, let it cool down, then we'll shut it down. Yeah, it's been a few minutes, no issues pulling its rated load. So I'll take the load off, let things cool down a bit. Actually, before we shut this down, let's push it a bit past what it's rated. Let's see what it can do. So we're going to bring the load back up, starting with 2,000 watts, 4,000 watts, 5,000. 5,500. How about 6,000? Amazing. It's handling 6,000 watts. So let's swap that for a 2, which will bring us up to 6 again. How about 65? Incredible. 7,000? I can't believe it's doing that. This is only rated at 5,000 watts, and it's pulling 7,000 watts. Although to be fair, this doesn't have a voltage regulator, so the voltage is a bit low, and it's likely not actually 7,000 watts, but still pretty impressive for a machine that I gave almost no chance of ever running again. I've got to admit, going into this, I gave this engine pretty much no chance. It was locked up hard, and when we pulled the spark plug, we saw the rust blew in there with compressed air, and there's basically a cloud of rust blowing out of this engine. I didn't think it would run again, and certainly not run as well as it is. This engine, it starts first pull. It can pull its rated load, and at the end of the day, that is really all you can ask for. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.